Welcome to session 18 of our class on the Conquest. We're in 1 Samuel chapter 27. In his more mature years, David heard God say to him in Psalm 32, verses 8 and 9, I will instruct you and teach you in the way you should go. I will guide you with my eye. Do not be like the horse or like the mule. These chapters record the experiences of David when he was living without that kind of intimate, loving guidance here in 1 Samuel chapter 27 and following. In 1 Samuel 27 verses 1 and 2, David had been a fugitive for about 7 years when he decided to flee to Gath. But the idea of leaving Israel had probably already been in his mind as we look back to chapter 26 and verse 19. David had every reason to stay in the land and continue to trust God for protection and provision. After all, he was the anointed king of Israel, and he knew that eventually God would give him the throne. Abigail had reminded him of this in chapter 25, verses 27 to 31. And even Saul admitted that David would ultimately be victorious in chapter 26 and verse 25. Now, Saul didn't keep one of his promises to leave David alone, and the constant flattery of the liars in his inner circle encouraged the king to keep on pursuing David. Living the life of a wilderness exile with his life daily in the balance may have started to weigh on David and depress him. After all, he now had 2 wives and 600 men to care for. In about 3 years, David's exile would end, and he would be ruling the people of Judah and Hebron, but he had no way of knowing this. It takes both faith and patience to receive what God has promised, Hebrews 6 and verse 12, and David seemed to be wavering in both of these essentials. He needed the faith and courage expressed in Psalm 27, verses 1 through 3. But before we criticize him too severely, let's recall the time when we've done the same thing. This scene reminds us of a similar situation in the life of our Lord as he faced the cross in John 12, 20 through 33. In John 12, 27 and 28, Jesus said, Now is my soul troubled, and what shall I say? Father, save me from this hour. But for this purpose I came to this hour. Father, glorify your name. Jesus had the Father's glory uppermost in his heart, while David was concerned primarily for his own safety and comfort. Yet God was using the difficulties in David's life to make him a man of God and to prepare him for the throne. But now he decided to go his own way and solve his own problems. God's children must be careful not to yield to hopelessness. Moses was discouraged over his heavy workload and wanted to die in Numbers 11:15. And Elijah ran from his place of duty because of fear and discouragement in 1 Kings 19. When we start to look at God through our circumstances instead of looking at our circumstances through God's eyes, we will lose faith, patience, and courage, and the enemy will triumph. Proverbs 3 and verse 5 says, Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and lean not on your own understanding. Now we come to verses 5 through 8. From every point of view, it was good that David should move away from Achish's capital, but especially because he needed freedom to operate his own independent policy without being observed too closely. Achish, in his role as king of a city-state with dependencies, had the feudal right to bestow land, and his choice of Ziklag for David was particularly suitable. In the first place, it was a border town in the foothills between Philistine and Simeonite territory. Though allocated Simeon, in Joshua 15:31 it is listed among Judah's towns but either it was never occupied or it had been reconquered by the Philistines. From the time of Achish's gift, Ziklag belonged to the kings of Judah, in verse 6. But from David's point of view, Ziklag had the advantage of being well away from Saul's territory and isolated from the major Philistine cities. Its main disadvantage was that it tended to be the target of marauding bands from the desert, Amalekites particularly. Achish stood to gain from having David's army to protect his southern territory. He may also have hoped to have won the support of Judah against Saul, which might have enabled him to take the whole land, as he very nearly did in the Battle of Mount Gilboa in 1 Samuel 31 and verse 7. Now we are told that David is in this area for a year and 4 months. David was sufficiently long in Ziklag to build up relationships with Israelites living in the far south. We'll see this in 1 Samuel chapter 30, 26 through 31. In verses 9 through 12, David directed his attacks against the plunderers who despoiled Judean as well as Philistine towns. His policy of extermination protected him from informers who might have told Achish that David was playing a double game. David would report that he had fought against Judah or Judah's allies, whom David had actually protected. In chapter 28, verses 1 and 2, David found himself in a tight corner when Achish committed his army to fighting against Saul, and David to becoming chief bodyguard to Achish. David's answer, designed to avoid a straight reply, satisfied Achish, but probably left David wondering how he would escape this dilemma. In chapter 28, verses 3 through 25, we find that Saul consults a medium. When this episode opens, the battle lines are already being drawn, but Saul has no heart for the battle. He desperately needs someone on whom to lean for advice and encouragement, but he finds himself totally isolated. The repeated mention of Samuel's death and burial shows Saul deprived of the great prophet's guidance, which in any case he had earlier disregarded. The illegal substitutes for prophets, that is, mediums, who supposedly consulted the dead, and wizards who supposedly speak on behalf of the dead, Saul had banned these types of people from Israel. By his own action in obedience to the law, Saul had rightly cut himself off from the resort of those who did not know the Lord. The fact that he now regrets this indicates how far he has departed from his early commitment. Now Shunem in the valley of Jezreel was about 20 miles north of Aphek, the most northerly Philistine city. The fact that the Philistines had penetrated thus far gives an indication of their dominance over Saul's kingdom and of their intention to press further east to the Jordan. Therefore, Saul's choice of Mount Gilboa, which was a vantage point from which to observe the movements of the enemy on the western slopes of the hill of Moreh across the valley. Saul was afraid with the kind of fear that gnaws physically and incapacitates a person for action. The Lord did not answer him by any of the permitted means that remained: dreams, which could have given him direct guidance, the Urim, which is the priestly oracle of which he had deprived himself when he killed the priests at Nob, or by prophets trained in Samuel's school. Despite Saul's legislation against mediums, the king's own servants were very well aware that they still practiced their trade in the land. Endor was only a short distance away, on the north of the hill of Moreh, and it was accessible despite the Philistine forces being close by. Saul disguises himself in verses 8 through 10 and goes by night, furtively like a criminal, with just 2 companions. Despite the finality of Saul's last confrontation with Samuel, he still longed for the word of the Lord which he had received through the prophet who first anointed him and proclaimed him king. He must have hoped that Samuel would somehow reverse the judgment which he had pronounced, in much the same way as some of our contemporaries refuse to take seriously the dark side of the Word of God. He says, "Divine for me a spirit," and therefore indicates the nature of the claim made by the medium, because he wants the woman to conjure up someone from the dead. She is appalled because she suspects a trap and fears the death penalty. Inconsistently, Saul swears as the Lord lives that she will be safe, while he himself endeavors to reverse the word of the same living Lord pronounced against himself. In verses 11 through 12, the indication is that the woman was taken by surprise when Samuel appeared to her. It was a moment of revelation, hence her crying out with a loud voice, and her realization that the person who was consulting her was Saul, the king. The incident might tell us about the truthfulness of the claims to consult the dead on the part of mediums, because the indications are that this was an extraordinary and unusual event for her, as well as a frightening one because she was not in control. In my opinion, this simply shows that mediums did not have any true power, because she is the one who is surprised when Samuel comes up from the dead. That God had allowed this in this one instance is the only way it could have happened. Otherwise, if she could truly raise the dead, then we are giving the power to raise the dead to Satan. As we saw earlier, God had commanded that all people such as this should be killed. If God was the one who was giving them the power to do it, why would he then command them to be killed? Thus, if they had any true power, then it must come from Satan. Therefore, if that is true, then Satan has the power to raise the dead. Is that a conclusion to which we want to come? I think not. Sorry about that. In verses 13 and 14, we have the words, "I see a God coming up out of the earth." The word Elohim, as it is translated here, God, when it's used with plural, and in that case it means judges, authority figures, in addition to gods. In this case, it is probably better to translate the word a divine being, or a being not of this world. The appearance of Samuel clearly impressed upon her his authority and dignity. Saul did not see Samuel, but was dependent on the woman's description. An old man wrapped in a cloak is a vague description from which we might think it would be impossible to identify anyone, but the key word may be robe, the prophetic robe, the tearing of which had become the symbol of Saul's downfall as king. Moreover, Saul knew intuitively that his request had been granted, and he prostrated himself before Samuel as if before the Lord. In verse 15, Samuel says, "Why have you disturbed me?" These words of Samuel suggest that Saul had interrupted a life of restfulness which Samuel had been enjoying and had been reluctant to leave. The short answer to his question was that Saul was utterly desperate. God has turned away from me and answers me no more. Saul is asking for guidance when his course of action is obvious. He has to fight the Philistines. What he really wants is assurance that all will be well and that he will win the battle. Samuel, however, does not in any way change the message he had spoken to Saul when he lived at Ramah. He's still the prophet of the Lord, and he speaks in the name of the Lord, repeating that name 7 times in these 4 verses. Far from reversing the judgment of the Lord, Samuel can only reinforce it, for the word he had spoken is about to be fulfilled. The Philistines, who in Saul's early days as king had defied the armies of Israel and had terrified Saul, are about to defeat Saul and his sons, who will tomorrow be with Samuel in the world beyond the grave. The Lord will give the army of Israel also into the hand of the Philistines, for the people and their army are bound up with their king, and they too will suffer defeat as the result of Saul's disobedience. In verse 20, Saul, who had not seen the vision, but had heard only too plainly the prophet's words, was as good as finished already. The fatal truth overwhelmed him with deep fear, so that he fell prostrate, for there was no strength in him. Why he had eaten nothing is unexplained, but it is true most people in fear of their lives lose their appetite. In verses 21 to 22, we see that the woman took one look at Saul, and she knew at once that he was terrified, totally exhausted, and paralyzed with fright. The root of the word terrified can indeed refer to the fright in which the grip of death on a man becomes visible. Her good sense tells her that what the king needs is a good meal. Perhaps then he will feel better able to face the coming battle. Whether she appreciated the seriousness of the situation in the light of the word of the prophet, we cannot know. Most likely she was thinking in human terms of some way to boost the morale of the king. Though she could not save him from his fate, she could give him temporary help and comfort to strengthen his fainting spirits. But she was astute enough to realize that Saul was in no mood to eat. Therefore, she gives some sort of reasoned argument that since she had risked her life for him, he should be willing to do something for her. All this was the outcome of Saul's willingness to compromise with evil in order to escape the word of the Lord. It's hard to imagine a more terrible situation in which to find oneself. Verses 23 through 25, Saul at first refuses to eat, but eventually he was persuaded. In the middle of the night, in the dwelling of a woman who supposedly consulted the dead, Saul got up from the earth floor, sat on the bed, and watched all the familiar homely processes of preparing a meal, from the killing of the calf to the kneading of dough for baking. If the meal and its preparation were conducive to a feeling of normality, for it was a dinner fit for a king, that in itself was sinister, because Saul was soon, that is, in a matter of hours, to no longer be king. Saul and his 2 servants disappeared once more into the night. Saul had begun well, but early on he had shown signs of stubborn resistance to the requirement of Samuel that the king should be the Lord's obedient servant, ready to carry out to the letter the commands of the Lord's prophet. In the key battle against the Philistines, Saul had not waited for Samuel to perform the pre-battle ritual at Gilgal. As king, he reserved the right to take initiatives himself, regardless of Samuel's orders, and already he had earned the Lord's condemnation and the sentence, "But now your kingdom shall not continue." 1 Samuel 13:14. The whole sequence of events demonstrates powerfully that for Saul, everything hung on that matter of willingness to sink his own will in that of the Lord his God. He had wanted to savor the authority and power associated with the kingship, and therefore had asserted himself rather than accept the total domination of the prophet. He did not realize that there is in all valid human leadership the need to be subject to a higher authority, ultimately that of God himself, and that this is a relief rather than a humiliation. If Saul could have but realized the fact, he became humiliated as a result of his attempts to take control of events. Samuel's confrontation with Saul, witnessed by his troops, both at Gibeah and at Gilgal, was profoundly humiliating for the king. Now at Endor, when judgment is about to fall upon him and his family through the defeat by the Philistines, Saul is a nervous wreck, and he is in no fit state to lead the army. The pride of Saul, combined with the jealousy of David, had together cost him his throne and his dynasty. As for the wider implications of the incident at Endor, we learn how pervasive and entrenched were Canaanite practices even among the Israelites. Though violation of the law carried the death penalty, and the so-called mediums were officially banished from the land, they were still to be found, ready to operate if given an assurance of protection. People evidently wanted their services, and they were ready to pay for the privilege. So even after his death, Prophet Samuel speaks, but Saul receives the very message he had already heard. In the end, he had to do what he would in any case have done, face the enemy. The additional information that within 24 hours he and his sons would be dead was no help at all to his morale. Indeed, he would have been better without it. He did himself no good by approaching the medium. God's word stood and could not be altered. He should have believed it instead of thinking that by further consultation he could reverse its judgment. The Lord did not answer him because there was no more to be said. This brings us to chapter 29. In verses 1 through 11, we see that while all of this was going on with Saul, David and his men had been preparing to fight their own Israelite relatives, because there appeared to be no way of avoiding involvement with Achish in the fateful battle. In verse 1, we see that the Philistines had gathered all their forces. These words pick up the subject from chapter 28 in verse 1, where Achish was presumably in Gath. Here the Philistines are some 30 miles further north at Aphek, well on their way to the valley of Jezreel, but they're still about 40 miles short of Shunem, 1 Samuel 28 and verse 4. At that time, the Israelite forces were in Jezreel, a meeting place of routes, that is, several roads coming together at that point. And they were there before being deployed on Mount Gilboa for the battle. In verses 2 through 5, the Philistine army was on the march in an orderly manner, each section under the eye of the ruler of the city from which the troops came. Achish brought up the rear with David and his men in attendance. The army generals felt uneasy at the presence of David the Israelite and his men, here referred to as these Hebrews. Achish must have been under David's spell not to foresee objections from the forces which, after all, were going to war against the king of Israel. Though Achish reckoned that he had evidence of David's loyalty, the battles had been in the far south, not against the king in his traditional northern territory. Above all, they suspected David in the light of public opinion expressed after he killed Goliath, and they thought that he was having aspirations for the throne of Philistia. David, they argued, could become acceptable to Saul and Israel only by putting Philistines to death. So they demanded that he should be sent back to his place, namely Ziklag. In verses 6 through 8, we find the phrase, "as Jehovah lives." This is unexpected in a Philistine oath. Can it be that Achish has committed himself to David's God? Or is he being courteous to David and not swearing by Philistine gods? The latter option is perhaps more likely. Then we see the phrase, "I have found nothing wrong." It's providential for Achish as well as for David that the Philistine lords are discerning, and that they insist that David be far removed from military operations. As Achish saw the situation, however, it was embarrassing to have to dismiss the man he had appointed as his bodyguard, and he was at pains not to offend David. Go peaceably implies that David had the right to protest against this sudden reversal, and protest he did, as though he were suffering an injustice, whereas he must have been inwardly relieved to be out of the battle. In verses 9 and 10, we have the phrases, "You are as blameless in my sight as an angel of God." This is a phrase that is full of praise of David on the part of Achish. And therefore we see again that Achish thinks a great deal of David. In verse 11, David and his men returned to the land of the Philistines, having been honorably dismissed, while the Philistine troops went to Jezreel to fight against Saul. And while that is going on, David's army would be the only fighting men remaining in the land. Excuse me. This brings us to chapter 30. Though David had seen God's providential purpose in sparing him from fighting against Saul, he faced a desperate situation on his return to Ziklag, and he might have concluded that the Lord had deserted him. It was the culmination of bitter attacks from enemies throughout his period of preparation for the throne. In verses 1 through 6, the phrase "on the third day" indicates that David and his men covered about 25 miles a day on the march south through Aphek to Ziklag, where they would arrive tired, hungry, and expecting all the comforts of a welcome home. The sight of a burnt-out, totally destroyed town was more than the troops could bear. The Amalekites, whom Saul had failed to exterminate back in chapter 15, they had taken advantage of the departure of the fighting men to wreak havoc, but at least their wives and families had not been killed. Instead, the Amalekites had taken them all captive, regarded them as part of the spoil to be enjoyed or sold, but there was at least some hope of recovering them from the enemy. David had suffered in exactly the same way as everyone else. He lost his 2 wives, but at the same time he was held responsible for the disaster. All the pent-up anger and indignation were laid at his door, for the people spoke of stoning him, the text says. Never since his flight from Gibeah and Saul had David stood so alone. Though he had often been in danger of death, David had strengthened himself in the Lord his God. Well, far from blaming God for allowing the destruction of the city, David took the reprisal of the Amalekites as one of life's hazards. in which he could draw on the resources of a faithful covenant Lord. As the Psalms attributed to David tell us over and over again, David poured out his feelings freely in prayer. In verses 7 through 10, when David needed specific guidance, he could call on Abiathar the priest to bring the ephod, which would give a positive or negative answer to the question, shall I pursue after this band? Given a positive and encouraging response, David set out immediately with all his soldiers. Despite their weariness, action was needed as an antidote to their feelings of frustration and aggression. Nevertheless, the extra traveling proved too much for a third of David's soldiers, who went only as far as the brook of Besor. They would have traveled some 12 miles or so southwest of Ziklag, on top of the march already that they had performed that day. In verses 11 through 15, travel in the unpopulated desert of the south had special hazards. In particular, there was rarely anyone to ask for directions, and there was no way of knowing where the Amalekite raiders were to be found until David's men happened upon a half-dead Egyptian who they coaxed back to life. As it turned out, he had accompanied his Amalekite master on a series of raids until he had to be left by the roadside because of illness. We come upon the phrase here also, the Negev of the Cherethites. Now, Cherethites are always mentioned together with the Pelethites or the Philistines, and both groups had come from Crete. Understandably, they settled in adjoining areas on the coast of Canaan. Cherethites showed special loyalty to David and later formed part of his bodyguard. The districts of Beersheba, which belonged to Judah, and Hebron, associated with Caleb, had suffered in addition to Ziklag. David was likely to endear himself to several communities. Therefore, if he could defeat and punish the raiders and recover the spoil they had taken, then these communities would be indebted to him. The fears of the Egyptian slave give some indication of the way he could easily have been treated, but in exchange for the help he can give, he negotiates for his life and freedom. In verses 16 through 20, thanks to their guide, David and his men found the camp of the Amalekites, and they observed from some vantage point the unrestrained partying that spread out as far as the eye could see. Then we see that it says, and David smote them from twilight. The Hebrew word that is translated twilight or dawn in other places has this sense here. Having noted the situation, David and his men took some rest and attacked at first light, when the Amalekites would be suffering from the sleep-inducing effects of the feast and least able to defend themselves. The fight lasted till the evening of the following day. That is the period of the day we call afternoon, when the sun, or evening when the sun is declining. David completely overwhelms the Amalekites, killing all except the 400 who escape on camels. And he recovers all the spoil, but more importantly, he recovers the human captives. The honor belongs to David now, just as earlier he had been obliged to take the blame. The verbs reiterate his prowess. David smote them. David recovered all. David rescued. David brought back all. David also captured all the flocks and herds. Whereas the odds had been stacked against him, now that he has won the day, everyone understands that this is David's spoil. In verses 21 to 25, the question of the spoil dominates the remainder of the chapter. When those who had been left at the brook Besor went out to welcome the returning victors, they met with a grudging attitude on the part of some. Each was permitted the return of his wife and children, but the wicked and base fellows, who may even have been a majority, wanted to exclude them from any share in the spoil. David exercised his prerogative, laying down the principle which became standard practice, and he established a legal precedent. First, he expounds the reasoning behind his decision. The outcome of the battle had been the Lord's doing. Therefore, the spoils come from the Lord. Now, this theological interpretation of events, the Lord has given, He has preserved us, is well understood and widely accepted. Those who remained at the base camp with the baggage had equal shares with those who fought in the battle. David's sense of justice was instructed by his experience of the mercy and generosity of his Lord, and for that reason, it surpassed ordinary human standards of what is just and right. In verses 26 through 31, though the spoil technically belonged to David, his men had reserved the right to express an opinion as to the way in which it should be used, and David had no intention merely of enriching himself with it. For one thing, it was right that those who had been raided should receive some compensation. For another, David no doubt had an eye to the future and intended to make the spoil work on his behalf. His friends, the elders of Judah, were heads of the communities of the region south of Hebron, who David had got to know during his enforced exile. Many of them had endured raids, and now they would receive some reparation from the enemies of the Lord. I know we're not quite to the point of making it to an hour. We're well short of it, but we're going to stop right here and do a short session at this time. That is, just make this a short one. And we'll pick up with chapter 31 in the next session. Thank you.